Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Ken Keyes became a teacher in the late 40s. That was his first passion, and I think that continues to be a passion now, at the age of 92. He spent time as a city alderman, elected mayor of the city of Kingston, and served as a member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament for 4 years until his defeat at the polls in 1990. In this episode, he and I sit down and reminisce about public service, retirement, and his great affection for life on the largest of the Thousand Islands, Wolfe Island. You may not be familiar with all the names and places mentioned, but I think you'll enjoy the journey. Here is our conversation with Ken Keyes. Ken, welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
I want to thank you for giving us some time today, and for our audience, for those of you who are listening, a reminder that we are recording this particular episode in mid-May of 2023, and we have the pleasure of recording it on Wolfe Island, which is where you live. And I'm looking out the window here, and it's a gorgeous view. It's a gorgeous day. And I guess we'll start with that. Why have you lived here so long on this island?
Well, I think it's because of our ancestors. I mean, our Keyes family have been here since 1840s and had 6 generations living on the family farm, and still taken over now by a cousin who's the only son of John Keyes, and he was granted the farm and when settled the estate when my father died. So I bought this old house, which was a total wreck, and people said, tear it down, don't try to repair it, it's so bad a shape. So I didn't listen to them very well. I've never regretted it because I was a bit of a handyman, do some carpentry work, and my son, I have 2 of them, and they were both able to help out, and neighbors and relatives and so on. So there was a keen interest in seeing this old house because it's over 100 years old, and it became a project. So I bought it in 1991 from the previous owners, because the father there had passed away, and there were 3 daughters that were given the ownership of it, and one of them then contracted cancer, and the girls had refused to sell it to me a year before, but then after that devastating news, I said, if you're still interested, we're still interested in selling. So.
Now, for those people who don't know much about the geography here, Wolfe Island is a fairly big island, right where the St. Lawrence River meets Lake Ontario. So if you're looking at a map, that gives you a sense. How big is this island in terms of length, and how many people are actually living here?
All right. Well, the island is the largest island of the Thousand Islands.
Okay. And
it acts like the cork in the neck of a bottle, and with the top end being used, the east end. The island is actually 21 miles long, and it's 7 miles wide at its widest place, and less than a kilometer wide at its narrowest place.
Right.
So it's been here, and it's got lots of history with it. There is a former canal went through the island just for safety of transportation. There was a lot of things. In fact, this house was, before it was a residence, was a shop, and it was a dock built out there, and farmers used to bring hay down to the dock, and it'd be taken by boat, and in the winter times by sleigh, to the States and shipped into Cape Vincent and loaded on a train, and the produce was taken to New York City.
So it's fairly close to the States, fairly close to Canada, and again, for those who don't know the island, the only way to access it really is by ferry, is to get from the
That's
mainland
correct.
at Kingston to Wolfe Island. And you were talking about the house and the history of the house. And for those listening, this house is located on a fairly busy road on Wolfe Island.
It used to be Highway 96, and then when the province amalgamated among townships, they, quote, gave the road to the township and said, well, it's your responsibility, you look after it. So
Yeah.
in exchange for them taking it, it's always been controversial, but the government paid the township $1 million to take over, and they said that'll look after your future maintenance. Well, some councillors thought that was a fair deal. A lot of others said it was a robbery, that they were saddled with a big expense without the remuneration, and it'd be a tax burden to the islanders.
So you grew up on Wolfe Island, and you got to the point where it was time to go to university, and you decided to look at teaching. And what was it about teaching that interested you in terms of university?
Well, this may surprise you, but I never once thought of being a teacher when I went through high school. Back in those days, you had grade 13.
Right.
And grade 13 was quite often a 2-year program. It depended upon how enthusiastic you were about your studies. And I remember going through grade 13, couldn't stand trigonometry and algebra. I always wondered why trigonometry was. In fact, I made a remark of that nature in the legislature one day and got rapped by one of the education ministers of the opposition, who said, well, it's obviously you didn't learn anything from it. But I said, I've never used it in my knowledge ever since. Mm-hmm. That's all I've done. But no, what happened was I was going to a one-room country school on our own family farm, and my grandfather had sold or given, I cannot find a deed or anything to verify whether he got $5 for the acre of land or whether he gave it to them, but it was certainly a small amount of money. And it was a stone school, and it's the only stone school on Wolfe Island. It unfortunately is in just total disrepair because the current owner won't sell it. I've tried to buy it. My brothers tried to buy it. My father tried to buy it and couldn't get it back from them. So it's sitting there with the roof caved in, and it's a disgrace to the island and to the career. But I was at school there, and that's where my sister Wynne went, and my brother Art, and my brother Lorne, and myself. And we went to that school, but in 1937, it was closed because there were only 3 students in the school. And that was my neighbor's daughter, my brother Lorne, and myself. And the teacher was my aunt. And she taught us and got $600 a year for her teaching. And they decided that eventually, with the farmers being what they are, children were born. And the inspector was J.E. Horton, who was the minister's representative to check the schools and so on. And he had noticed that a bunch of these children were in the neighborhood but weren't in school. So they said, you got to get those children in school. And the farmers said, we're not going to pay, it's too costly to drive them to the village school and then on to high school, so we won't. And so they said, well, let's advertise and see if we can get a teacher to work. Well, they said, first of all, you got to have 8 students to reopen a school. And secondly, you're not going to get any men applying because it's after the war, and they're taking their free studies at universities. So they won't. I said, well, let us advertise anyway. So the school board was a 3-person board made up of our neighbor, Oscar McCready, my uncle, Alan Keyes, and my father, John Keyes. So they advertised and didn't get one response, male or female. So they still said, well, we got to get them to school. So the father came home from the meeting, he was chairing the board, and said, guess what? you're going to be the teacher for these kids because we're not going to take them to the village to school. It's costly. So you're the teacher. And I said, well, I have no idea, but when you're 17-year-old, which I was, you don't argue with Dad.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, well, then we had to go through finding out, getting some permission from the government to do it. And so it was about the only year, I think there were only 2 years in the history of the educational system in Ontario where they allowed you to have a temporary certificate to teach for 2 years on condition that you went to Toronto Normal School on Pape Avenue for 2 summers to learn what you should be teaching the kids. But so I stayed and did that and went to Toronto Pape Avenue. But as I said, the only thing I can really remember that was of any use to me is they taught you how to knit. That was the big thing.
So you ended up teaching in this area after you finished your education, and you were teaching and acting as a principal as well in this area. Did you go outside the area with your teaching career, or was it basically all here?
No, on Wolfe Island I was in 2 schools in Wolfe Island. The one that I had gone to when it was closed up and then reopened in 1948 with myself as not only the teacher, but the janitor and the principal, the whole 9 wax. And interesting because we only had, out of the 8 children we had to have, we only had 7. So what are we going to do? Eventually, we decided that there was a family that we already had 2 of their children, and they'd had another one born, a girl, Catherine, and she was 4 years old. And so we made a deal with the parents that, well, let's let her come to school anyway. Bring her over in the morning at 9 o'clock, but don't come to get her till just after 1 o'clock. And that way we'll call her as full day attendance in kindergarten. So as I said, as a 4-year-old, we had junior kindergarten on Wolfe Island before the province ever thought of such a thing. So that was always an interesting thing, I thought. And with those 8 children, we had 4 of them who were Dutch children, didn't have a word of English. So that was a challenge in itself. And the only thing that made sanity for me, perhaps, was we had a boy who was in grade 8, and he was 16 years of age, and I was the teacher, and I was 17 years of age. And then I became an 18-year-old on the 16th of September and carried on. But then 2 years later, I got married, and we had another school up on the west end of the island called the Ridge School, and my mother had bought out her 2 brothers' interest in the family farm when they sold it, and so we went and lived in that house. No running water, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, and that's where we lived for the 2 years that I was the teacher up at the school called the Ridge School, because there was a high ridge of land. And then I had a chance to go to the city, to Berryfield Village, to be in, and Mr. Smart was Smart Fisheries, and he was the chairman of the school board, so he kind of, when I expressed an interest, he came and talked to the fishermen that are on the island. What did they think of this Keys kid? Was he any good? Was he a reasonable person to deal with? So I got a recommendation of him, and I was hired then as the principal of Berryfield Village School, which the year after I was there, we had an interesting one, because at Berryfield Village, we had a 2-room school, but we had 3 teachers in it. So the primary teacher was Rita Kelly, and her classroom was the cloakroom of the school. So they were totally illegal, but they had 21 desks jammed into that, and kids would come in, they were all tight together, so they had to walk down the seats of the desks in order to get in. And Rita Kelly survived there. I always admired her. She was a great teacher. And then the junior division was Helen Schlichter, and she was taught on my staff for quite a while. And then I was the principal, but also the grade 8, 7 and 8 teacher. So stayed there. And then they built a new school, the J.E. Horton School in Berryfield Village. And I was there to kind of supervise that. And it was a nice school, and we did a lot of work around it. There were a couple of farmers owned us rotted manure, and we made flower beds around it. And I had a young fellow that was a problem student, and he'd been in a lot of trouble with the police, and I got him to help me go and pick up the manure and build the flower beds, etc., and then got him to water the flowers all summer long. And the school board were so impressed with the fact that we'd changed his life around for him, and they paid him $25 for the summer's work of keeping the gardens up.
It's really interesting to go back and reminisce about these events that happened and the people that you met along the way. And I think what tends to happen a lot these days is we don't spend a lot of time looking back and reviewing some of the history and some of the names of the people. And I know a lot of you who are listening won't recognize the names, but you'll understand that this goes back to the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and just the development of the community on Wolfe Island as well as the community in Kingston. One of the areas that you and I share some history on is involvement with an organization in town that's an international organization, and there was a chapter in Kingston, and it was called the JCs, and some people called it Junior Chamber. Why don't you describe, from your perspective, what the organization was all about?
Went JCI, so Junior Chamber International, but as you said, a lot of people called it a Junior Chamber, etc., and people would get that mixed up with the Senior Chamber, thinking the difference. But I was introduced to it by a chap that, was the sales agent for Great West Life. Okay. Because I still cannot recall my first meeting with him. I've been trying to do that, but I haven't been able to reconstruct it. But he was the father of Bill Bishop, who was a lawyer at one time in Kingston. And Frank took an interest in me, and he came to the island, and I took him duck hunting, and he wanted to get young Bill to get a chance to see that. So I remember so well on opening day of duck hunting, I carried young Bill on my back because he was just a much younger fellow, and took him down to the blind so he could watch and see what we were doing with the duck hunting. So Frank was the one that introduced me to JC's, and it was called a service club, but it was not the usual style of service club, because it was really meant for self-improvement, self-development, as well as your community. Mm-hmm. And I had the benefit of having time. In addition to my teaching, I was teaching in the city then, and we took public speaking, and that was always a great standby. Chairmanship of committee, so you learn how to chair dinner meetings, committee meetings. You learned parliamentary procedure with Burnow's rules of order, etc., and all of those things really helped me, because I was from Wolfe Island. I hadn't been to that much, even to the city, and until I went to high school. And high school, of course, was different in a sense, because we'd gone to continuation school here, grade 9 and 10. So we were always 2 years behind the socialization of the students that you're in school with. Yeah. But I had in my class all through the years that I was there was 3 of the doctors of Kingston, Dr. Hooper and Dr. Keenleyside and Dr. Millen. They were all students who became doctors. And we had teachers. Dusty Perrin was a Latin teacher, and Mrs. Kidd was the English teacher. And then the toughest one of all, first of all, the principal was J.L. Murray, and the vice principal was his name to my student body, but not in front of him, was Cannonball Kelly. he'd been a military person, and he was very strict. And he was right at the foot of the stairs was his classroom. And every time there was a change of classes, he made sure that you didn't go up the down staircase or vice versa.
Well, I can remember those days I went to Regiopolis to finish off my high school, and it's, there's a strict code, whoever was in charge, and it's like you say, you can't go down the up staircase and you can't go up the down staircase.
That's right.
And all the other rules that they imposed upon you. I recognize the fact that when I joined, which was a while after you were an active member, because in JCs, what they would do is you would be there till you turned 40. And it was more of a young man's, at that time, organization. And I can remember sitting down at a table with some of the prominent people in Kingston who shared the experience of going through that organization and credit it with really helping them get a start on their careers, whatever their careers ended up being.
And a lot of it was chairing different committees. We had the Over the Hill Derby, Patrick Street Hill, and that was something you chaired and worked on that when there was Santa Claus Parade. That was also the thing. And the other thing that gave me inspiration to go into the politics side of it was used to run Get Out the Vote campaigns, and the JCs did that in order to set up candidates meetings in the different wards and get people to turn out. And I decided after chairing that one year that I thought I was probably as smart as many of the people who were running for alderman, and I thought if they can do it, I can do it. So then the next...
So you ran for a municipal office?
Yes.
And that would have been, what, in the... I'm just trying to figure what year it would have been. 70s?
I think it's 70s. I haven't got that one in my head at the moment. That's something I have to add to.
Because you were an alderman at the time, is what they call them.
Yes, right.
For
I was
12
an alderman
years.
in Victoria Ward, and I had been the chairman of Victoria Ward, where I didn't live. I lived in Union Street, 59 Union, in the heart of Queen's University. And but I was the chairman of Victoria Ward, and so I'd made a lot of acquaintances, so I decided if I'm going to run, I'll run there where I'm fairly well known. Unfortunately, I didn't make a decision to run until late in the game, and the other two candidates who were running, in those days you had 2 aldermen per ward, was Dick Graves, who'd held the position for several years, and George Spiel was a new candidate. And he and I were buddies that I'd met in high school because we were in the same form together. And we had a great time campaigning. We'd both be doing the same street. He'd be on one side and I'd be on the other. And he said, well, I don't know who's going to win, but surely it'll be one of us. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, George, it's going to be whoever gets to the most houses first. And that was the thing that I noticed about it. The number of people where you went to the door and said, if I can go to vote for you, I don't know anything about you, but you came and asked for my vote, and you've got it. And I said, that's what will make it work. And then on election night, Dick Graves came first in votes, but I came second, and George couldn't believe that he didn't get he had the third highest number of votes in the election, but he didn't get a seat on the council.
Now, you were an alderman for 12 years, and you ended up running for mayor, and you served in that role for 4. Any particular highlight from your time as mayor that sticks out for you?
Well, just thinking of personally, I mean, it was the year the Olympics were here, and we had the sailing Olympics, and George was the mayor, and I was the deputy mayor, so I had the chance to represent him in a lot of functions connected to the Olympics. And it's also when I was in the provincial side of things, I was great at looking at the recent royal wedding with Princess Anne, and I represented the province in escorting her off back to England on one occasion. So those things kind of stick in your mind, even though they're not significant to the other people involved. But.
Right. And we're talking about the 1976 Olympics. They were hosted in Montreal, but the sailing portion was conducted here in Kingston. And for those of you listening who are avid sailors, if you want some freshwater sailing, this is the place to come to. And people from all over the world come here to sail.
And they do it from every type of competition. I mean, there are maybe a dozen different type of boats that they have, and people keep coming back year after year. It's the Cork Regatta.
When I was sitting in a meeting that both of us were at, and you were telling a story about the National Defence College, and I had heard the words but had no real sense as to what it was all about. But when you told the story, I thought it was worth repeating here because it sounded really interesting. So this was an opportunity you had when you were on City Council, correct?
That's right, and this was actually my final year as being mayor, and I'd asked the school board, they had a system that you could have a sabbatical where you take your salary instead of over, let's say, 4 years, you take it over 5 years, and you can still have a year off to do something. So I applied for it, but I got turned down by the board because I said I was prepared to go and talk to teacher groups and the rest of it when I returned to talk about the places we'd been, because it was a year-long program held at the Fort Frontenac Officers' Mess, and you studied 3 weeks intensely at the college, looking at 3 areas. We looked at the military side of things and the health side of things and social and justice. So that was what you learned about the countries you were going to visit. And in the course of the year, we visited 20 countries, and that was and met the head of state in every one of those countries. Started out by going across Canada and doing the same with every premier in every province and the territories, and looked then at groups like the lumber industry and the forestry industry and the mining industry, and we had a chance to go down in a mine in Sudbury, etc., and look at the forest where they're making all of the plywood and the rest of things of that nature. So it was, and then you had 42 students in the class, and they came from Australia, Great Britain, China, and other military officers that were the rank of captain or colonel. And
we've said before on the show that Kingston is a big military town. It has a big military base, which is one of the reasons why this college would be located here. When you went to visit those 20 countries, which countries would you be visiting?
Well, we visited Australia, we visited China, and in China we were looking at their industrial development, and every time you looked, it seems though the equipment was shut down, and they say, in total inspection, they were having problems with it. We were in Japan. We were in, I always remember one in particular with Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and he gave lots of speeches to us about when he took over the country, how different it would be. There'd be no political affiliation. It would be all done by consensus, and everyone would be free to vote the way they wanted. Well, we thought that was great, and we all applauded him on such a endeavor. But the minute he did win, he, of course, took over all the land that had been owned by the wealthy farmers who were British people mostly, and put under very tough rules, so that was difficult. But Japan, we were looking at in the high quality of work. The first time I saw there with them building Honda cars and building motors and robots that drilled a solid block of aluminum and then get drilled for the valves and the pistons, etc. It was really something, and very, very efficient. And they had kind of foremen, and they ran around those areas on bicycles. It wasn't a case of you walked from part of the line, you rode a bicycle to do it.
That would have been an interesting opportunity.
Oh, unbelievable. I said it's the best year of my life, and somebody said, well, wasn't your marriage the best thing? I said, well, that was partly away from it. I mean, this was an opportunity, and there were a few Kingston people. Flora was the most prominent person that had also gone ahead of me, but I was a mayor and said, well, we've never had a representative from the city on that course. How about we get one? So I had good friends with the Commodore, and he said, well, I'll just work it up and do something. So I got one of my most controversial aldermen to nominate me as a representative of the city of Kingston, and the crowd went with it, and so I got the chance to be there. And it was interesting because Flora was running for re-election, running against Peter Milliken, and she said, well, I don't think that Keys needs to be into arms or into NDC, and I'll make sure when I get back in that he doesn't. But lo and behold, I had a drink at the officers' mess that day with the Commodore, and he said, well, sorry, Ken, but your name has kind of gone to the bottom of the list. You're not going to get in. And I said, oh, well, that's fine. We might get a chance again sometime. The next morning he called up and said, better go back for another drink. Guess what? Flora got defeated, and your name's number one on the list for being a student. So never forget that.
We're talking about Flora MacDonald, who was the representative at the federal level for Kingston. Yes. And for those of you who have listened to this podcast on a regular basis, you may recall that we did do an episode featuring an author who had written a book about Flora. So we had talked about Flora and her career. You decided at some point that you wanted to try provincial politics. And from what I have read, you took 3 stabs at it before you got in the front door.
That's right.
Over the course of, 14 years?
14 years. I was an alderman, and then was the mayor, etc., and deputy mayor as well before the mayorship. And I had said that I had set myself mentally, never publicly stating it, but that I was going to try and remember the J.C. Creed, service to humanity is the best work of life. And that was my goal, to do that. I felt I had started out by being a 17-year-old teaching kids at school, was service to that community. And then as I became in the city, I did with the salaries I made was very small. When I taught school, I got $1,500 for the year as a salary, and then they decided the school needed a janitor, so I got $60 to be the janitor for the year as well. So when I was in the city, I decided I can't donate much in the way of money to charitable organizations, but I've got lots of time, so I did lots of canvassing and work for Red Cross and the United Way and the rest of it, and still keep up that to a lesser degree now, but still believe in supporting the community.
Yeah.
And so I felt that, again, running for public office, it still lived up to my goal of service to humanity. And I still believe that that's the thing that maybe politically we've kind of lost sight of to some extent today. People are more interested in themselves and getting in there. It's like one of the other tenets of the J.C. Creed, the government should be of laws rather than of men.
Yeah.
And that's another area that we're...
Well, you can tell one of the aspects that needs to be addressed, too, is people getting out to vote. And there's, people aren't voting the way they should be in terms of numbers and consistency.
And knowledge of the issues.
So you served 4 years for those of you outside the country, the provincial legislature is based in Toronto, and it deals with activities in the province of Ontario and laws and those services, those sorts of things. So you were there for 4 years, and that would put us into 1990.
That's right.
In terms of the chronology here, which is when you retired. So now...
Retired because I got defeated.
So after you were forced to retire back in 1990...
Yes, right.
So that was 33 years ago.
Yes.
So you've been retired. I'm curious to know what you have been doing in retirement to keep yourself busy.
Well, I still supported the many of the social organizations, the United Way and Red Cross, Cancer Society, and Easter Seals, and so on. But I also bought this house in 91 is when it actually was closed, and then spent at least 5-6 years working on getting it in shape. Because when I come in here to look at it, you stand in that doorway, goes into the kitchen, you can look straight up and see the sun, because it was just in such a terrible shape. But anyway, we made it comfortable, and then I've enjoyed it ever since, even though we did have an accident with a young lady parked her car in our living room.
That's right. We were talking about that before we started recording. And this happened, what, a few years ago?
Yes, it'd be about January the 14th was the date, and that was about 7 years ago. 6 years.
So a young lady was driving along this fairly busy road and lost control of her vehicle, and it ended up inside the house. And fortunately for you and your wife, you were upstairs, and so you weren't injured, and no one in the car was injured. But it did wreak havoc on the house.
It did wreak havoc in the house. In fact, the bill for repairing the house was $150,000. But fortunately, my insurance company looked after it, but then just recollected from
the other insurance company,
the other party involved. So I was very, very lucky. It was a 10-minute difference of going to bed. At night, it was 10:30 at night. Going to bed, a 10-minute difference, and we'd have both been taken out because the Chesterfield in that room over there ended up right on this room. That was the force of it. And the father admitted that the car was doing, because he's a mechanic, and they have, I don't know what it is, but they can tell how speed they were going.
Yeah.
And she was going 70 miles an hour when she hit the house. And it just cleaned the whole side out, so they had to rebuild this wall and that wall. And
of a 100-year-old house.
A 100-year-old house. Yes. But it's in better shape today from the repair work. And the very interesting thing was the crew that did it, that won the contract, were all Russians. There were 4 of them, and all Russians, and only one, the foreman, spoke any English. But they were great workmen, and so the house was much better. We had just finished, my son and I, doing all the outside paneling and all the inside floors, but they were wrecked, so all the floors, and they turned around and changed all the floor joists, put all new floor joists in underneath here. So
like you say, it's in much better shape now.
It's much better shape than when it was built originally, 100-some years ago.
I want to wrap up by asking you a question. As someone who has been involved a lot of his life in teaching, and you have met a lot of people and traveled quite a bit. Given your observations these days, is there a particular subject in school or a field of study that you think should have a little bit more of a focus than some of the others, given our current situation?
Well, I'd say there are 2 areas. You need to have much more emphasis on financing, and when you see the status of the young people today are so far in debt, and with a 1% raise in an interest rate by a government Bank of Canada, and some of them are going to lose what they've saved up to buy.
Yeah.
And so financing is certainly one thing, and I think the other aspect is more knowledge of government, so that whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, they need to have more emphasis on, well, they used to call it civics. That's what it was years ago. But so I think there's more of that. But nowadays, when you look at and listen about artificial intelligence, and you can see there was quite an article on last night's news of the fear that the federal government is now seeing that artificial intelligence is going to end up, and they put good examples of the supposed arrest of Trump in the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
And that's so the challenge. I'm 92, so I'm not too upset when the day comes that I've done.
So what you're saying is you don't want Chat GPT, which is the artificial intelligence software, to create your eulogy for you.
No, I'm doing my own.
Well, listen, Ken, I really appreciate your time, and I've enjoyed our conversation, and I want to thank you for your service, whether it be teaching or municipal or provincial politics or all the work you've done with local agencies, and all the best going forward to you.
Thank you very much. And the only other thing that I could say was, and a good-sized family of 6 children. My extended family now with the children and the grandchildren amounts to 42. So we don't have dinner together very often.
All right, sir. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Again, special thanks to Ken Keyes for sharing some of his life story in this episode, recorded in May of 2023. To those of you listening, thank you, and I'll be back soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the kingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.